Okay, now troubles with the esophagus. One of them you've probably heard of is called GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. See, gastroesophageal reflux disease. And this feels like just endless heartburn. Really, really bad heartburn. And this happens because stomach acid, and sometimes just fumes from stomach acid, because stomach acid is actually hydrochloric acid, which can become gaseous if you move around a lot. So even the fumes from stomach acid back up into the esophagus. And usually this happens because the lower esophageal sphincter has, for some reason, been compromised. So when that happens, the stomach acid can creep up the esophagus and result in a number of different problems. You can end up with lesions or a hiatal, not a hiatal hernia. That'll happen down the road. That includes, if you have a hiatal hernia, in that case, that would include the development of GERD and give other problems with foods. But basically, when people have GERD, a lot of times what happens is the tissue gets deteriorated and lesions and ulcers develop in the esophagus. How do we fix this? Well, there are some dietary changes. A lot of times if somebody has GERD, they can't drink alcohol, greasy foods, spicy foods are a problem. Sometimes weight loss is necessary. Sometimes the pressure of the pressure of weight overlying the stomach can cause problems. There are acid blocking medications that block the production of hydrochloric acid in the stomach or inactivate it in certain ways to help with GERD. And then there are other medications that strengthen the lower esophageal sphincter, which then closes off the opening, which won't allow the stomach acid to creep up into the esophagus. So here's an example showing you the lower esophageal sphincter. So that's the sphincter here that's going to block stuff from going up. Here's stomach acid. Stomach acid, along with food, we call this chyme in the stomach. So it's food, water, acid, all kinds of stuff. And in this particular case, we're looking at an example where doctors will go in and make a little suture, just make a little fold to kind of allow a narrowing of this space so that gases can't go up as easily. All right, so let's talk about the stomach. The size of the stomach definitely expands after a large meal. The stomach usually starts out, again, is about the size of your fist, and it can stretch out to the size of 2 fists. And if you really work on it and you work on your stomach flexibility, I guess you could say, you can stretch it out up to 3 fist sizes. The pylorus is the lowest part of the stomach, and we'll look at a picture of that in a minute. And the pyloric sphincter is basically the closure that separates the stomach from the duodenum, which is the beginning of the small intestine. Now, the wall of the stomach has lots and lots of smooth muscle in it, and the contractions produce that churning movement or peristalsis, like I mentioned before. Now, remember, peristalsis is the contraction of smooth muscle in the digestive tract, and it's really obvious when you are able to see peristalsis in the stomach. I'll see if I can find a video of that. It's kind of fun to see. The lining of the stomach is a mucous membrane, lots and lots of mucus in our stomach. And the reason why it's there is because there are a lot of glands that secrete gastric juices, which include that hydrochloric acid, right? Here's our HCl. And the mucus helps kind of line the stomach and protect us from that gastric juice and hydrochloric acid that we secrete to help do what? Well, first of all, the hydrochloric acid is there to kill bacteria that we eat. Bacteria is everywhere, guys. Just get used to the idea. And much of it gets destroyed if we swallow it by the high concentration, or I guess you'd say the low pH of hydrochloric acid, and also gastric juices. The mucous membranes have folds in them, which are called rugae. And those folds are kind of like, I kind of think of rugae like the stomach's elastic. So, you know, when you see elastic, like elastic pants or elastic on sweatpants or something, you can pull the elastic band out and it stretches out the band of the pants, right? Really good when you're eating, especially at Thanksgiving time. But the rugae are like the stomach's elastic. That's how the stomach can stretch and get larger, is those rugae flatten out as you stretch it out. So rugae folds are a way that the stomach can expand. So here are the rugae, and as the stomach expands outwards, because somebody put a lot of food into it, those rugae flatten out. So it's a way to increase the surface area of the interior of the stomach. When we look at the stomach, here's the lower esophageal sphincter here, separating the esophagus from the stomach. The top of the stomach is the fundus. Most of the stomach is the body of the stomach. The muscularis are the 3 layers of smooth muscle, the longitudinal, circular, and oblique muscle layers that allow peristalsis to occur. So the oblique muscles contract in this direction, the circular contract laterally, and the longitudinal contract longitudinally. The oblique, let me get a different color here. Blue would probably look better. The oblique does tend to be at an angle. Oblique oftentimes is diagonal, guys, just so you know. All right. We have the serosa, which is on the outside, that connective tissue layer, the submucosa, and then the mucosa, which is basically that outer surface of the rugae. We have the greater curvature of the stomach, so basically the outside curve, the lesser curvature, the inner curve. Here's the pylorus, the end of the stomach, which is separated from the duodenal bulb, basically the beginning. This is going to join with the small intestine, the duodenum. So the pylorus is joined with the duodenum via the pyloric sphincter here. So disorders of the stomach. Gastroenterology is the study of the stomach and the intestines and all the diseases. So that's going to include the large and the small intestine as well. So gastritis is inflammation of the stomach. Oftentimes, if you have a stomach ache, well, that's what we're going to call, oops, I want to erase this if it'll let me. Oh, of course not. Gastritis is inflammation of the stomach, and oftentimes you'll feel a stomach ache, not nausea necessarily, but a stomach ache. Anorexia is appetite loss. I know that a lot of students know about anorexia nervosa. That is a neurological syndrome that is linked to appetite loss, which is anorexia. Sometimes, let's say, for example, when you are catching a cold, or for example, when I got my COVID shot, both my first and my second, I had a period of anorexia. I didn't want to eat. I was not interested in food. I wasn't per se nauseous, but I just didn't want food. Anorexia itself is separate from anorexia nervosa. Now, nausea is an upset stomach that I was talking about, and nausea leads to emesis, which is vomiting. And remember, peristalsis takes food going down. Nausea and emesis take the food back up, all right? And nausea is just one of the worst things in the world. Now, pylorospasm is the abnormal spasms of the pyloric sphincter. Pyloric stenosis is similar as well. And what happens during pylorospasm is the pyloric sphincter, which if we go back one here, here's the pyloric sphincter, is allowing food to go back and forth. That can lead to pyloric stenosis, which means that the pyloric sphincter isn't necessarily working properly, and it can lead to the narrowing of the pyloric opening, which means that the stomach is unable to drain appropriately. So stenosis always means kind of like scar tissue, or I guess the way I think of stenosis is it's like adding thickened tissue to a spot, okay? So stenosis isn't a good thing. Ulcers are open wounds caused by acid and gastric juices. Ulcers are often found in the duodenum or in the stomach, all right? So let's go back here to this picture. Here's the duodenum. There can be duodenal ulcers or stomach ulcers as well. And sometimes that can happen because somebody's stomach just produces too much hydrochloric acid. It can also occur with an infection of Helicobacter pylori, H. pylori. All right, so this is like the funnest science, not the funnest, but one of the most amazing and to me fascinating medical awards ever earned. The gentleman who was studying Helicobacter pylori discovered that there was a high link in the number of people who had ulcers and also had an H. pylori infection. And so he kept taking the data to medical meetings, to medical conferences, and people thought he was kind of, oh, haha, isn't that funny? No, ulcers are made by acid and gastric juice in the stomach. Well, what he did was to prove that H. pylori produces ulcers is he went back to his lab, he mixed up a fine concoction of H. pylori and drank it. He gave himself a massive, massive series of gastric ulcers, and then he healed himself taking antibiotics. So H. pylori does cause ulceration in the digestive tract that can be healed with antibiotic treatment. On the other hand, NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, can lead to ulcers as well. NSAIDs are things like ibuprofen, Aleve, and so forth. And usually when you take this medication, you're supposed to take it with food to help buffer the stomach and protect the stomach. Now, stomach cancer is usually associated with extreme consumption of alcohol or eating a lot of preserved food or chewing tobacco. Preserved foods would be things like lots of jerky, anything that has nitrates in them, salamis, things like that. Really nasty for you. We talked about the cancer, mouth cancer, remember, from the chewing tobacco? Same thing. All right, we're going to move on to the small intestine now from the stomach. The small intestine has three regions: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The small intestine is about 20 feet long, but it's real thin, about 2 centimeters, which is maybe a little more than an inch in diameter. The wall contains lots of smooth muscle so that it can contract and produce peristalsis. Remember, pushing the food down normally through the digestive system. The lining is a mucous membrane. Lots of microscopic glands called intestinal glands. We'll talk about those in a minute. These glands make intestinal juice, which we'll talk about for sure. We have microvilli in the lining of the small intestine. These are small projections that increase the surface area of the mucosa of the small intestine and the individual villus. So they look kind of like this. And maybe these three, each villus is going to contain a blood vessel and a lacteal, right, from the lymphatic system. Ooh, that green looks too yellow. Let's make it more green. Remember, lymphatic is always green, and artery or oxygenated blood is red, and deoxygenated blood is blue. So this is how this is partly how absorption brings food. Let me make a piece of food. My food's going to be purple. Let's say I ate a grape. The food's going to be digested. It's going to be transported through the microvilli into the bloodstream or into the lacteal. Here's a much nicer picture of what I was trying to draw. Oh, look at that. So here is a microvillus. Each one, singular is villus. The lacteal extends up through the villus, and the lacteals tend to absorb things like fats and so forth. And then we have our blood vessels. The mucosa is right here in yellow. The epithelium is right here in pink, and each one of these is a microvillus. A single villus, plural is microvilli, and this is how they look on the surface of an epithelial cell. An individual cell will have many, many microvilli. What that does is if you open this up, again, it increases the surface area to allow massive absorption of nutrients into our system. As the absorption happens, the food gets absorbed, or the biomolecules. I'm not even going to call it food anymore. I'm going to call it amino acids from proteins, sugars from mostly glucose, actually. I'll call it glucose from carbohydrates, and different parts of, I guess you'd call it hydrocarbons from the fatty acids get absorbed into these structures, and they go through our body, circulate through our body through the circulatory system. Super cool. So disorders of the small intestine, enteritis. Enteritis is where the small intestine has some sort of inflammation. So gastroenteritis is inflammation of the stomach and the intestines. Malabsorption syndrome, this typically is a situation where an individual is unable to absorb a certain biomolecule, maybe a carbohydrate, maybe a fatty acid. This can occur for a number of reasons, which we could talk about later, but it typically leads to anorexia. You don't want to eat, because of abdominal bloating, cramps. It can lead to anemia depending on what's not being absorbed, and definitely fatigue, because if you're not absorbing nutrients, you're not making a lot of energy. In the next lecture or in the next video, we'll talk about the liver and the gallbladder.